On a frozen November night in the Montana Rockies, a wounded mare limped through thickening snow to a rancher's door, her eyes carrying a desperation that pierced through 8 years of buried grief. When Jack Brennan forced open the stable he had locked the day his daughter died, he found a woman clinging to life and evidence of a crime so vast it threatened every soul in the valley. From that moment, the walls he had built around his heart began to crack, and a reckoning with both the past and the present became unavoidable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled down from the Rockies with a bite that could strip paint from wood, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the promise of heavy snow. Jack Brennan stood on the weathered deck of his ranch house, watching the tree line blur into darkness as the storm gathered strength. The mountains that ringed his property had turned to shadows, their peaks lost in clouds that pressed down like a hand closing into a fist. He pulled his coat tighter, though the cold that troubled him came from somewhere deeper than weather. Broken Pine Ranch sat alone at the edge of the national forest, miles from the nearest neighbor, exactly the way Jack had wanted it for the past 8 years. The main house sagged slightly on its foundation, the paint peeling in long strips that he never bothered to fix. The corrals stood empty, the fences mended but unused. He had sold off his cattle years ago, keeping only what he needed to justify calling himself a rancher. The solitude suited him. It asked nothing, expected nothing, and reminded him of nothing except the passage of seasons that he marked without caring. His hair had gone from black to steel gray in those years, though he was only 52. The lines around his eyes had deepened from squinting at horizons he no longer found beautiful, and his hands, once quick and sure, now moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned that haste brought only regret. He had been a forest ranger once, proud of his uniform and his knowledge of every trail and creek in this corner of Montana. People had called him when they were lost, when the mountains turned dangerous, when someone needed bringing home. He had worn that responsibility like armor, believing he could protect everyone who ventured into the wild places he loved. Then came the day his daughter went missing on a trail he himself had recommended. Emma had been 19, bright and fearless, out with friends on what should have been an easy afternoon hike. When the call came through dispatch, Jack had felt his world tilt. He had led the search party himself, knowing every switchback and deadfall, every place where the trail narrowed or the ground turned treacherous. They found her at dawn, at the bottom of a ravine where the path had given way beneath spring runoff. The medical examiner said she had died on impact, that there had been no suffering, but Jack knew better. He had seen the scrape marks where she had tried to climb back up, the broken branches where her hands had grasped for purchase. She had fought to live, and he had not reached her in time. His wife left 6 months later. She never said the words, but Jack understood. Every time she looked at him, she saw the man who had sent their daughter into the mountains, the ranger who was supposed to know better, the father who had failed the most important rescue of his life. The divorce papers arrived with a lawyer's letterhead and no personal note. He signed them without contest and watched her taillights disappear down the valley road on a morning much like this one, cold and merciless. The stable where Emma had kept her horse stood 100 yards from the main house, half hidden by a stand of lodgepole pines. Jack had not opened its doors since the week after her funeral. He had sold Emma's mare to a family in Willow Ridge, taken the tack down from its hooks, and padlocked the heavy timber doors with hands that shook so badly he could barely fit the key. The building had become a monument to everything he could not face, a physical manifestation of the locked chambers in his heart. Some nights he dreamed of fire consuming it, reducing it to ash so he would no longer have to see its silhouette against the sky. But he never acted on those dreams. Destroying it would require caring enough to make the effort, and caring was the one thing he had sworn to abandon. The wind shifted, and Jack caught movement at the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was a trick of the failing light, a branch swaying or a shadow cast by the clouds. Then it came again, more distinct. A horse moving slowly up the access road that led to his property. The animal was limping badly, favoring its right foreleg, and its gait carried a wrongness that made Jack's chest tighten with unwanted concern. He told himself to go inside, to let whatever tragedy was unfolding pass by without his involvement. He had learned that lesson. Interference brought only pain. But the horse did not pass by. It turned into his drive with clear purpose, as though it knew exactly where it was going. As it came closer, Jack felt something cold and sharp lodge itself beneath his ribs. The mare was bay with a white blaze running down her face, the same coloring as Emma's horse. The same build, the same way of holding her head even in obvious distress. Could not be the same animal. He had sold that mare years ago to a family with young daughters, people who would care for her properly. Yet the resemblance was uncanny enough to make his hands grip the railing until the wood bit into his palms. The mare stopped at the gate to his yard, her sides heaving with effort. Snow had begun to fall in earnest now, fat flakes that caught in her mane and melted on her steaming flanks. Blood darkened her right shoulder, a wound that glistened wetly in the porch light. Not a cut from barbed wire or a stumble into rocks. This was something else, something deliberate. The shape was too clean, too purposeful. Jack's old ranger instincts stirred despite himself. That looked like an arrow wound, the kind made by a broadhead hunting tip driven deep into muscle. The mare lifted her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes, dark and liquid in the dim light, held an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. She was not simply seeking shelter or help. She was asking for something specific, demanding it even. Her ears flicked forward, then swiveled toward the stable before returning to fix on Jack. She did it again, a deliberate gesture that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. She wanted him to follow her to the stable. She wanted him to open those doors. Jack's throat tightened. He shook his head, a reflexive denial of what his eyes were telling him. Animals did not behave this way. They did not lead people with intention, did not communicate across the gulf of species with such clarity. Yet the mare waited, patient despite her injury, her gaze never leaving his face. When he did not move, she took 2 halting steps toward the stable, then turned back to look at him again. The message could not have been clearer if she had spoken it aloud. Every instinct Jack had cultivated over 8 years of isolation screamed at him to retreat. Go inside, lock the door, let the storm handle whatever crisis had arrived on his doorstep. He owed nothing to this animal, to whatever desperate situation had driven it here. He had paid his debts to duty and responsibility with his daughter's life and his own shattered soul. The world could burn, and he would watch from behind closed doors, safe in the numbness he had. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Worked so hard to achieve. But Emma's voice whispered in his memory, a fragment from years ago when she was still a child, maybe 10 years old, kneeling in the stable with a wounded bird cupped in her small hands. Dad, we have to help. We can't just walk away when something's hurting. That's not who we are. He had agreed with her then, had helped her splint the bird's wing and release it weeks later when it healed. He had been proud of her compassion, her certainty that helping was not a choice but an obligation. Who we are. The words echoed in the empty spaces of his chest. He was not that man anymore. He had become someone else, someone smaller and harder, someone who understood that compassion was a luxury that cost too much. Yet his boots were already moving, carrying him down the porch steps before his mind had finished its arguments. The snow bit at his face as he crossed the yard, each step feeling like a betrayal of the vows he had made to himself. The mare watched his approach without moving, her breath coming in labored clouds that the wind tore away. When Jack reached the gate, he saw the full extent of her injury. The arrow had struck high on her shoulder, penetrating deep enough that only a few inches of the shaft remained visible. The fletching was gone, likely torn away as she moved through brush, and the wood was snapped short as though she or someone else had tried to remove it. Blood had soaked her coat and dried in dark streaks, though fresh flow still seeped around the wound. She had been traveling for hours like this, perhaps longer, driven by something stronger than pain or exhaustion. Jack unlatched the gate, and the mare pushed through immediately, moving past him with single-minded determination. She headed straight for the stable, her limp pronounced but her pace unfaltering. Jack followed, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that felt both familiar and terrifying. He had not felt anything this strongly in years, had not allowed himself the vulnerability of emotion. Now it surged through him like floodwater breaching a dam, cold and relentless. The stable loomed before them, its timber walls dark with age and weather. The padlock hung on its chain, crusted with rust from years of disuse. Jack pulled the key from his pocket, a key he had carried every day despite swearing he would never use it again, and his hand shook as he fitted it to the lock. The mechanism resisted, frozen by time and neglect, then gave way with a crack that sounded like breaking bone. The chain fell away, and Jack stood before the doors he had sealed on the worst day of his life. The mare pushed against the wood with her nose, a low sound rumbling from her chest that was part pain and part insistence. Jack grasped the iron handle, cold enough to burn his palm, and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, a wail that echoed across the property and sent birds scattering from the nearby pines. The doors swung open, releasing a rush of stale air that carried scents of old hay and leather and something else, something recent and out of place. The smell of fear. Jack stepped inside, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The stable's interior was exactly as he had left it 8 years ago, frozen in time like a tomb. Emma's saddle still hung on its rack, the leather cracked from abandonment. Her bridle dangled from its hook, the bit tarnished but intact. Ribbons from horse shows lined one wall, their colors faded to ghosts of blue and red and gold. He had meant to pack these things away, to donate them or burn them or do anything but leave them here as monuments to his failure. Instead, he had simply locked the door and pretended the stable no longer existed. The mare moved deeper into the building, her hooves echoing on the wooden planks. Jack fumbled for the lantern he knew still hung by the entrance, found it by muscle memory, and struck a match. The flame caught, and warm light spread through the space, pushing back shadows that seemed reluctant to yield. The mare had stopped at the far stall, the one that had been hers when Emma owned her. She was looking down at something, her ears pinned back, her entire body tense with an emotion Jack could not name. He moved closer, the lantern held high, and saw what the mare had been trying to show him. A woman lay curled in the straw, her body so still that for a terrible moment Jack thought she was dead. Her dark hair was matted with mud and blood, her clothes torn and soaked through. She clutched a waterproof bag to her chest with both arms, holding it as though it contained her last breath. Her face was pale, almost blue in the lantern light, and a gash above her eyebrow had bled down her cheek and dried in rusty streaks. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, his ranger training surging back despite the years. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse, and found it, thready and weak but present. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by a cascade of questions he had no way to answer. Who was this woman? How had she gotten here? Why was she in his stable? And how had the mare known to bring him to her? The woman's eyes fluttered, her lashes dark against her bloodless skin. Her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear. Jack leaned closer, his ear nearly touching her mouth, and caught fragments of sound that barely qualified as speech. They poisoned the water. The samples. Have to stop them. Her hand tightened on the bag she held, knuckles going white with effort. Then her eyes closed again and she went limp. Jack sat back on his heels, his mind racing through implications he did not want to consider. Poisoned water. Samples. Someone trying to stop her. This was not a simple accident or a hiker who had lost her way. This woman had been running from something or someone, and whatever she carried in that bag was important enough to die for. The mare stood over them both, her wound forgotten, her entire focus on the woman in the straw. The connection between them was obvious now. They had been together when whatever happened had happened. The mare had brought her here deliberately, had sought out Jack specifically, had refused to leave until he opened the doors he had sworn to keep closed. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, and snow began to fall in earnest, thick enough to erase the world beyond the stable walls. Jack looked at the woman, at the mare, at the ribbons on the wall that testified to a life that had ended too soon. He thought of Emma's voice, of the certainty she had carried that helping was not optional, that turning away from suffering was a betrayal of everything good in the human heart. He had spent 8 years proving her wrong, demonstrating through his isolation that turning away was not just possible but necessary for survival. Now, kneeling in the stable he had locked in grief and rage, Jack felt the foundations of that belief begin to crack. The woman needed help. The mare had risked everything to bring her here, and Jack, despite every wall he had built and every vow he had made, could not walk away. Not this time. Not again. He lifted the woman carefully, surprised by how light she was, how fragile her bones felt beneath his hands. She did not wake, but her breathing steadied slightly as he adjusted her weight. The mare followed as he carried her toward the stable entrance, her limp forgotten in her determination to stay close. The snow was falling hard now, already covering the ground in white that glowed faintly in the darkness. Jack looked toward the main house, calculating distances and difficulties, then made his decision. He could not move the woman far in her condition, not through a storm that was rapidly becoming a blizzard. The stable would have to serve as shelter until he could assess her injuries and decide on the next steps. He turned back inside, the mare pressing close as though afraid he might change his mind, and kicked the stable doors closed against the wind. Jack worked by the light of 2 lanterns, their flames casting long shadows that danced across the stable walls like memories given form. The woman remained unconscious as he cleared space in the tack room, dragging out old blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme. His hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had once been trained for emergencies, though the knowledge felt rusty, like a tool left too long in the rain. He spread the blankets in layers, creating a makeshift bed that would at least keep her off the cold floor, then returned to where she lay in the straw. The mare had not moved from her position beside the woman, despite the arrow still lodged in her shoulder and the blood that continued to seep down her leg. Her eyes tracked every movement Jack made, assessing him with an intelligence that bordered on unnerving. He had known horses all his life, had worked with them during his ranger days when trails became too narrow for vehicles, but he had never encountered one that seemed so deliberately aware, so purposeful in its actions. The way she watched him felt less like animal observation and more like judgment, as though she were measuring his worth and finding it barely adequate. He lifted the woman again, noting the way her head lolled against his shoulder and the shallow rhythm of her breathing. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps late 20s, with features that would have been striking under better circumstances. Now they were obscured by mud and blood and the gray pallor of someone who had pushed their body past reasonable limits. Her clothes told a story he was beginning to piece together. Not hiking gear despite the mountain setting. She wore cargo pants with multiple pockets, a technical jacket designed for fieldwork rather than recreation, and boots that were expensive and well-maintained. A professional of some kind, not a tourist. The waterproof bag remained clutched to her chest even in unconsciousness, her fingers locked around it with a grip that suggested muscle memory more than active choice. Jack did not try to pry it away. Whatever she carried was clearly vital enough to hold on to through injury and exhaustion, and he had learned long ago that forcing things rarely ended well. Instead, he settled her onto the blankets, arranged her limbs into something resembling comfort, and pulled another layer over her body to combat the cold that was already seeping through the stable walls. Only then did he turn his attention to the mare. She stood watching him, her weight carefully shifted to spare her injured leg, her ears swiveling to catch every sound from both inside and outside the stable. The storm had intensified, wind driving snow against the walls with a sound like thrown sand, and the temperature was dropping fast. Jack could see his breath now, white clouds that dissipated quickly in the lantern light. The stable had never been insulated for winter occupation. It had been built for summer use, a place to keep tack and provide shade, not to shelter life through a Montana blizzard. He approached the mare slowly, speaking in the low, steady tone his daughter had taught him years ago. "Easy now, girl. Let me take a look at that shoulder. You've done your part. Let me do mine." The mare's ears flicked toward him, then away, a gesture that seemed more like permission than submission. She did not move as he came close enough to examine the wound, though her muscles tensed beneath her coat and he could feel the trembling that ran through her body like an electric current. The arrow had been driven deep, likely from close range given the angle of penetration. The shaft had broken off roughly, leaving splinters that would complicate removal, and the wound itself showed signs of several hours aging. Blood had clotted around the entry point, but the edges were inflamed and hot to the touch. Infection was already setting in, or would be soon if he did not act quickly. Jack had removed his share of foreign objects from injured animals over the years, usually porcupine quills from dogs stupid enough to investigate what should have been left alone. But this was different. An arrow meant intent. Someone had shot this mare deliberately, and that someone had probably been trying to stop the woman she carried. He needed supplies he did not have in the stable. Antiseptic, bandages, tools to extract the arrowhead without causing more damage. All of that was in the main house, in the bathroom cabinet where he kept a basic first aid kit that had gone largely unused for years. Going back outside meant leaving the woman and mare alone, meant stepping into a storm that was rapidly becoming dangerous, but there was no alternative. He could not leave the arrow in place, and he could not treat the wound without proper materials. Jack pulled his coat tighter and pushed open the stable door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face with enough force to sting. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, the world reduced to swirling white and the dim glow of his porch light barely visible through the storm. He put his head down and walked, counting steps the way he had been trained to do when landmarks disappeared. 42 steps from the stable door to the porch. He had walked this path thousands of times, could do it blind if necessary, and tonight that skill was the only thing that kept him oriented. The house was cold when he entered, barely warmer than the outside air. He had let the fire in the wood stove die hours ago, not bothering to maintain it since he usually just bundled in blankets and ignored the temperature. Now he cursed his own negligence as he fumbled through the bathroom cabinet, gathering supplies by feel as much as sight. Antiseptic that was probably expired, gauze that had yellowed with age, medical tape that had lost most of its adhesive. Not ideal, but it would have to serve. He added a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a package of disposable gloves he had never opened, and a pair of needle-nose pliers that would work for extraction if he was careful. On impulse, he grabbed the emergency kit from the hall closet, the one he had maintained during his ranger days and never quite abandoned. It contained more sophisticated supplies, including a suture kit still in its sterile packaging and a bottle of veterinary antibiotics he had bought years ago for a horse that had tangled with barbed wire. The antibiotics were meant for livestock, broad spectrum, and strong enough to knock down infection if administered quickly. He had no way to know if they were still effective after sitting unused for so long, but attempting treatment with expired medication was better than watching infection take hold without opposition. The return trip to the stable took longer, the storm having intensified enough that the wind actively pushed against him. Snow had already accumulated several inches deep, erasing his earlier footprints and making the footing treacherous. He slipped twice, catching himself both times but feeling the jar of impact in his knees and remembering that he was not as young as he had been during his ranger days. 52 was not old, but it was old enough to feel the difference between what his body could do and what it once had done without thought. When he finally pushed back into the stable, the mare greeted him with a soft nicker that sounded almost like relief. The woman had not moved, her breathing still shallow but steady, her face turned toward the lantern light as though seeking warmth even in unconsciousness. Jack set his supplies on a wooden crate and began organizing them with the methodical care of someone buying time to steady his nerves. He had done this before, had treated injured animals in the field with limited resources, but never in circumstances that felt so weighted with consequence. This mare had come to him for a reason, had brought a woman who carried secrets important enough to die for, and everything about the situation suggested that failure would cost more than one life. He pulled on the disposable gloves, feeling the latex stick to his still cold fingers, and approached the mare with the pliers held low and visible. She watched the tool with evident suspicion, her ears pinning back briefly before relaxing as he continued his steady approach. "I know this is going to hurt," he told her quietly. "I'm sorry for that. But it needs to come out before infection takes hold. and I need you to trust me enough to let me try." The mare's eyes held his for a long moment. Then she lowered her head in what looked like resignation. Jack positioned himself beside her injured shoulder, feeling the heat radiating from the wound even through her coat. He placed one hand flat against her neck, both to steady himself and to give her a reference point of contact that was not painful, then carefully grasped the broken arrow shaft with the pliers. The wood was slick with blood and body fluids, making it difficult to get a solid grip. He adjusted his angle, tightened his hold, and pulled steadily, trying to extract the arrow along the same trajectory it had entered. The mare made a sound he had never heard from a horse before, a low, keening cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her chest. Her entire body went rigid, muscles standing out like cables beneath her coat, but she did not pull away. Jack kept the pressure steady, feeling the arrow shift fractionally, then catch on something internal. Bone or cartilage, something that resisted the removal. He paused, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, and adjusted his grip once more. The second attempt went better. The arrowhead came free with a wet, sucking sound that turned Jack's stomach, followed by a fresh surge of blood that soaked his gloves and ran down the mare's leg to pool in the straw. He dropped the arrow and immediately pressed gauze against the wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding while his other hand fumbled for the antiseptic. The mare trembled but held still, her breath coming in harsh bursts that fogged the cold air. Jack worked quickly, flushing the wound with hydrogen peroxide that fizzed and bubbled as it contacted damaged tissue, then following with antiseptic that made the mare flinch, but still she did not move. The wound was deep, deeper than he had hoped, and he could see the white gleam of bone at its base. The arrowhead had scraped the scapula on its way through, leaving a groove that would take weeks to heal properly. He packed the wound with gauze soaked in antibiotic ointment, then wrapped the shoulder with elastic bandage, working carefully to create compression without restricting movement. By the time he finished, both he and the mare were shaking with exhaustion. He stripped off the bloody gloves and threw them aside, then rested his forehead against the mare's uninjured shoulder, allowing himself a moment of weakness. The warmth of her body seeped through his shirt, and he felt her breath ruffle his hair as she turned her head to investigate him. Her muzzle pressed against his arm, a gentle touch that felt like forgiveness or perhaps acknowledgement. They had survived the first crisis together. Whatever came next, they would face as something closer to allies than strangers. A sound from the tack room pulled Jack's attention away from the mare. The woman was stirring, her head moving restlessly on the folded blanket he had placed beneath it. He crossed to her quickly, kneeling beside her makeshift bed and watching as her eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus in the dim light. When her gaze finally cleared enough to register his presence, fear flashed across her face and she tried to push herself up, her hand reaching for the waterproof bag beside her. "Easy," Jack said, holding his hands up in a gesture meant to calm. "You're safe. You're in my stable on Broken Pine Ranch, about 15 miles north of Willow Ridge. Do you remember what happened?" The woman's eyes darted around the space, taking in the lanterns, the mare standing nearby, the stable walls surrounding them. Her breathing quickened, and Jack could see panic building behind her eyes. He had seen that look before on lost hikers when they realized how far they had strayed from safety, on injured climbers when pain broke through shock. It was the expression of someone whose survival instinct was overriding rational thought. "My bag," the woman said, her voice hoarse and cracking. "Where is my bag?" She tried to sit up fully, gasping as movement pulled at injuries Jack could not yet see. He reached out instinctively to steady her, and she recoiled from his touch as though burned. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't touch me. Just give me the bag." Jack pulled back, keeping his hands visible and his voice level. "It's right here. You never let go of it. See?" He gestured to where the bag lay beside her, still within arm's reach, exactly where it had been since he laid her down. The woman grabbed the bag and pulled it to her chest, her arms wrapping around it protectively. Her eyes closed, and she took several deep breaths that seemed to be about more than just oxygen. When she opened her eyes again, some of the panic had receded, replaced by a wary assessment that Jack found easier to work with. Who are you, she asked. And how did I get here? Jack sat back on his heels, giving her space. My name is Jack Brennan. I own this ranch. As for how you got here, I was hoping you could tell me. That mare showed up at my gate about an hour ago with an arrow in her shoulder and a determination to bring me to this stable. When I opened it, I found you. The woman looked past him to where the mare stood, and her expression transformed. The wariness melted into something that looked like relief and guilt and affection all tangled together. Ember, she whispered. Oh God. Ember, you brought me all the way here? The mare's ears pricked forward at her name, and she took 2 careful steps closer, her bandaged shoulder moving stiffly but without apparent pain. The woman reached out with one hand, and Ember lowered her head to allow contact, her nose pressing into the woman's palm. Jack watched the interaction, filing away information. The woman knew the mare by name, had a relationship with her that went beyond casual ownership. The relief in her voice suggested she had been worried about the animal's survival, which meant she had been conscious when whatever happened had happened. She had known the mare was injured, had perhaps even sent her for help deliberately. That level of connection and training spoke to months or years of work together, not a recent acquaintance. I'm Rebecca, the woman said, not taking her eyes off the mare. Most people call me Becca. She paused, seemed to consider her next words carefully, then continued. We were attacked on the Clearwater Trail 3 miles south of here. Ember got me away before they could finish what they started. Jack felt his stomach tighten. Multiple attackers, which meant organization and intent rather than random violence. Who attacked you, he asked. And why? Becca's hand tightened on the waterproof bag. Because of what's in here. Because I have proof that Cascade Mining Corporation has been illegally dumping cyanide-laced tailings into the watershed that feeds Willow Ridge's reservoir. Because I can prove they've known about it for 2 years and covered it up. Because they've been bribing the state environmental inspector to falsify his reports. The words hung in the cold air between them, each one carrying weight that Jack felt settle onto his shoulders like physical mass. He had heard rumors about Cascade Mining, the way most people in Montana heard rumors about large corporations operating in their backyard. The company had moved into the region 5 years ago, promising jobs and economic development, building a strip mining operation that scarred the mountainside but kept men employed through seasons when tourism dried up. There had been complaints, whispers about changed water quality and increased illness in town, but nothing concrete enough to override the economic benefits the mine provided. Now this woman was telling him that the whispers had foundation, that children in Willow Ridge were drinking poisoned water while the company responsible paid officials to look the other way. The implications spread through his mind like cracks in ice. How many families affected? How many cases of illness that had been attributed to natural causes or bad luck? How many people had suffered because truth had been buried under bribes and corporate influence? Jack's first instinct was to reject the claim, to find reasons why it could not be true. Conspiracy theories were easy to construct and hard to disprove, and a traumatized woman with a bag full of papers was not necessarily a reliable source. But the arrow in Ember's shoulder argued against dismissal. Someone had gone to violent lengths to stop Becca from reaching help, and violence of that magnitude suggested she was close enough to truth to be dangerous. People did not attempt murder over paranoid fantasies or mistaken assumptions. They killed to protect secrets that could destroy them. You're an environmental scientist, Jack said, reading the conclusion from her clothing and equipment. Working for who? Becca's jaw tightened. I was working for Cascade Mining. They hired me 6 months ago to conduct routine water quality assessments and file the required environmental impact reports. She laughed, a sound without humor. They thought bringing me on staff would make everything look legitimate, that having their own environmental division would satisfy the regulators. What they didn't count on was me actually doing the job properly. She shifted position, wincing as the movement pulled at what Jack now suspected were broken or cracked ribs. I started finding anomalies in the water samples 3 months ago. Mercury levels that didn't match natural occurrence patterns. Cyanide concentrations downstream from the tailings pond that exceeded safe limits by factors of 10 or more. I documented everything, ran the tests multiple times to eliminate error, then started comparing my data to the official reports filed with the state. Every single one had been altered. Numbers changed, conclusions rewritten. They were submitting completely false information while paying me to generate accurate data they planned to bury. And when you confronted them about it, Jack said, they tried to eliminate the problem. Becca nodded. I didn't confront them directly. I'm not that stupid. But they monitor employee communications, and I made the mistake of emailing my sister about what I'd found. Corporate security came to my office the next morning and told me I was being transferred to a different site in Wyoming, effective immediately. They wanted me gone before I could make copies or reach out to regulatory agencies. She clutched the bag tighter. So I made copies anyway, grabbed everything I could, and ran. They caught up with us on the trail this afternoon. 3 men in a corporate vehicle that had no business being that far into the backcountry. I heard them coming and tried to get Ember off the path, but they had GPS tracking my phone. She swallowed hard, her eyes distant. With memory, one of them had a compound bow. Professional equipment, not something you take hunting for sport. He shot Ember to stop her from running, probably didn't care if he killed her as long as it slowed me down. But Ember kept going. She carried me through terrain that should have been impossible with that arrow in her shoulder, and she didn't stop until she found you. Jack looked at the mare, seeing her with new understanding. Ember had not simply sought shelter or stumbled onto his ranch by accident. She had made choices, assessed options, determined that bringing Becca here offered better odds of survival than continuing to run. The intelligence required for that level of decision-making went beyond anything his training had taught him about equine behavior. This was an animal who understood consequences, who could weigh risk and benefit, who had formed a bond with her humans strong enough to override self-preservation instinct. The storm outside intensified, wind hammering against the stable walls hard enough to make the structure groan. Snow was piling against the door, visible through the gaps in the boards, and the temperature continued to drop. Jack's breath formed clouds now even inside the shelter, and he could see both Becca and Ember shivering despite the relative protection the stable provided. They needed heat, needed food, needed medical attention more sophisticated than field dressing and expired antibiotics. But going back to the main house meant leaving the stable, meant exposing themselves to a storm that was rapidly becoming life-threatening. More than that, it meant making a choice that Jack had avoided for 8 years. Becca and Ember had brought more than just their physical presence into his life. They had brought responsibility, obligation, the weight of other people's suffering that he had worked so hard to escape. If he helped them, if he took their side against the forces hunting them, he would be opening doors that could never be closed again. His isolation would end. His carefully constructed indifference would shatter. He would become involved in something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the man he used to be, the ranger who believed protecting people mattered more than protecting himself. Emma's voice whispered in his memory again, clearer this time. Dad, we have to help. We can't just walk away when something's hurting. She had believed that with absolute conviction, had lived it in every interaction with the world around her. When she died, Jack had told himself that her conviction had been naive, that caring made you vulnerable and vulnerability got you killed. He had built his isolation on that foundation, had spent 8 years proving that detachment was survivable where compassion was not. Now, looking at Becca's pale face and Ember's bandaged shoulder, at the evidence bag that represented truth someone had tried to kill to suppress, Jack felt the foundation crack. Not because he suddenly believed in justice or duty or any of the abstract principles that had once motivated him, but because walking away would mean becoming someone his daughter would not recognize, would not claim as her father. And that, he discovered, was a cost he was not willing to pay. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the cold and the kneeling. You'll both stay here tonight, he said. The storm is too dangerous to risk moving you, and you need rest more than anything else right now. Tomorrow, if the weather clears, we'll figure out the next steps. Becca's eyes searched his face, looking for something Jack was not sure he possessed anymore. Can I trust you? She asked. Jack considered the question honestly. I don't know, but your mare seems to think you can, and she's made better decisions than most people I've known. That will have to be enough for now. He gathered the medical supplies and returned them to their bag, then pulled down more blankets from the storage shelf and spread them over Becca. Ember had already positioned herself beside the makeshift bed, her body creating a windbreak and source of heat. The mare's eyes tracked Jack's movements, that same measuring gaze that evaluated and judged, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being found marginally acceptable but still on probation. The night stretched ahead with no promise of easy resolution. Outside, the storm raged with Montana fury, erasing roads and landmarks and any possibility of outside help. Inside the stable, 3 wounded creatures huddled against cold and circumstance, bound together by chance and choice in measures Jack could not yet calculate. He settled onto a hay bale near the door, positioning himself where he could watch both the entrance and the 2 lives now dependent on his choices. Sleep would not come easily if it came at all. His mind turned over the information Becca had given him, testing it for weaknesses and finding none. If even half of what she claimed was true, then Willow Ridge faced a crisis that would reshape every assumption people held about their safety and their future. Children drinking poison water. Officials taking bribes to hide corporate crimes. Violence deployed against anyone who threatened the comfortable lies holding the system together. Jack had walked away from all of that 8 years ago, had decided that fighting battles not his own was a luxury he could not afford. Now the battle had come to him anyway, carried by a wounded mare and a desperate scientist whose courage had outlasted her strength. He had no weapons, no allies, no plan beyond surviving until morning. What he had was a stable full of ghosts, a badge he no longer wore, and a decision point he had been avoiding since the day he locked these doors and swore never to care about anything again. The lanterns burned low, their light casting shadows that danced and merged with the darkness gathering in the corners. Ember stood guard over Becca, her vigilance unbroken despite exhaustion and pain, and Jack, who had sworn he was done being responsible for other lives, found himself keeping watch over them both. His hand resting near the rifle he had brought from the house and his mind working through scenarios he had no business considering. Dawn would bring clarity or crisis or both. Until then, all any of them could do was survive the night and hope that morning offered options they could not see in the darkness. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and somewhere beyond the swirling snow, men with violence in their hearts were waiting for weather to clear so they could finish what they had started. Jack had no illusions about what that meant. They would come. The only question was whether he would be ready when they did. Part 3. The supernatural calm morning arrived without enthusiasm, gray light filtering through gaps in the stable walls to illuminate a world transformed by snow. Jack had dozed in fragments throughout the night, his body, demanding rest his mind refused to grant, and now he stood at the stable door looking out at drifts that reached past his knees. The storm had blown itself out sometime before dawn, leaving behind the heavy silence that follows Montana blizzards, a quiet so complete it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Behind him, Becca stirred on her bed of blankets, the movement accompanied by a sharp intake of breath that spoke to pain she could no longer ignore. Jack turned from the door to find her sitting up, one hand pressed to her ribs, her face tight with the effort of controlling her expression. Ember stood beside her as she had all night, the mare's presence a constant through the dark hours, and now she lowered her head to press her muzzle against Becca's shoulder in a gesture that looked remarkably like concern. "How bad is it?" Jack asked, crossing to where his medical supplies still sat on the wooden crate. Becca managed something that might have been a smile if pain had not twisted it into something else. "I've had worse hangovers." The lie was transparent enough that neither of them bothered to maintain it. Jack knelt beside her and waited until she stopped trying to pretend she was fine. "3 ribs on my left side," she said quietly. "Cracked, maybe broken. I felt them give when I hit the ground after Ember started running. There's also something wrong with my ankle, but I won't know how bad until I try to put weight on it." Jack nodded, adding the injuries to his mental catalog. Broken ribs meant restricted movement and pain with every breath. A damaged ankle meant she could not run if running became necessary. Combined with the hypothermia she had been fighting when he found her and the blood loss from various cuts and scrapes, Becca was in no condition to do anything except rest. But rest required safety, and safety was something Jack could not guarantee inside a stable, surrounded by miles of snow, with corporate enforcers somewhere in the region waiting for their chance. "Let me look at the ankle," he said. Becca extended her left leg with obvious reluctance, and Jack could see even through her boot that the joint was swollen. The leather stretched tight over flesh that had expanded beyond normal parameters. He unlaced the boot carefully, feeling her flinch with each movement, and eased it off to reveal an ankle that had turned purple and yellow, the bruising spectacular in its spread. Not broken, he judged after gentle palpation that made Becca bite her lip hard enough to draw blood. Badly sprained, though. You won't be walking on it without support, and probably not without significant pain. He wrapped the ankle with elastic bandage from his kit, creating compression that would help control swelling, then moved to examine her ribs. Becca pulled up her shirt with trembling hands, revealing a torso that was a canvas of bruising. The left side showed clear definition where 3 ribs had taken impact, the bones visible beneath skin as abnormal ridges that suggested fracture rather than simple bruising. Jack had seen enough broken ribs during his ranger days to recognize the pattern. These would hurt for weeks, would limit her breathing and movement, and could puncture a lung if she was not careful. "There's nothing I can do for ribs except wrap them for support and tell you to breathe shallow," he said. "If you start coughing blood or having trouble getting air, we'll need to get you to a hospital regardless of the risk." Becca nodded, not arguing, which told Jack more about her condition than any complaint would have. She was hurt badly enough that even she could not maintain denial, and that meant the situation was more precarious than he wanted to acknowledge. He wrapped her ribs as carefully as he had wrapped Ember's shoulder, creating support without restricting breathing, then helped her ease back down onto the blankets. Becca closed her eyes, her face gray with pain and exhaustion, and Jack left her to rest while he turned his attention to the more immediate problem of survival. The stable had been adequate shelter during the storm, but it was not designed for extended habitation in winter. The walls were thin, the floor was dirt covered in straw, and there was no source of heat beyond body warmth. They needed to move to the main house where the wood stove and insulation would make survival more than a temporary state. But moving Becca meant exposing her to cold that would stress her already compromised system, and moving Ember meant forcing a wounded animal through deep snow that would reopen her injury with every step. Jack weighed the options and found none that did not carry significant risk. Stay in the stable and hope they could generate enough heat to survive another night, or risk the journey to the house and hope neither Becca nor Ember collapsed before reaching shelter. Neither choice was good. One simply had to be less catastrophic than the other. He was still debating when Ember moved to the stable door and stood looking out at the snow-covered landscape with an intensity that made the hair on Jack's neck rise. The mare's ears were forward, her body tense, every line of her suggesting high alert. Jack joined her at the door, scanning the tree line and the long approach to his ranch for whatever had caught her attention. At first, he saw nothing but white and the dark verticals of pine trunks. Then movement registered, subtle but unmistakable. 3 figures on snowmobiles, coming up the valley road from the direction of Willow Ridge. Jack's stomach dropped. The men hunting Becca had not waited for complete road clearance. They had adapted, switching to machines that could navigate deep snow, and now they were coming with the confidence of people who believed their prey was trapped and helpless. He watched them approach, noting the way they spread out as they came, creating a formation that suggested military training or at least tactical awareness. These were not amateurs playing at enforcement. They were professionals who knew their business and came prepared to finish it. "We have company," Jack said quietly, not turning from the door. Becca struggled to sit up despite the pain, her face going even paler as she processed his tone. "They found us? Already?" Jack nodded, his mind racing through scenarios and finding none that did not end badly. "They're about 10 minutes out, moving carefully but directly. Someone either tracked us here or made an educated guess about where a wounded horse would go. Either way, we're out of time." Becca's hand went to her waterproof bag, clutching it as though physical contact could somehow protect its contents. "The samples, the documents, everything that proves what Cascade has been doing is in here. If they get it, if they destroy this evidence, people will keep drinking poison and nothing will change." Her voice cracked, not with fear but with frustration born of knowing how close truth had come to light only to be snuffed out by violence and corporate power. Jack pulled away from the door and began moving with purpose that surprised him. 8 years of deliberate stagnation fell away as training and instinct reasserted themselves, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. He grabbed the rifle he had brought from the house and checked its ammunition, finding it loaded but knowing 5 rounds would not be enough if the situation turned into extended engagement. His handgun sat in a drawer in the main house, useless given the distance and danger involved in retrieving it. What he had was a rifle, some medical supplies, and a stable full of hay that would burn beautifully if anyone thought to use fire as a weapon. "Can you ride?" he asked Becca. She stared at him as though he had suggested she sprout wings and fly. "With broken ribs and a sprained ankle? I can barely sit up." Jack nodded, already moving to the tack room where Emma's saddle still hung on its rack. "Then Ember carries the bag and I carry you. We're not staying here to be cornered like animals in a trap." Becca opened her mouth to argue, then closed it as the sound of snowmobile engines became audible even through the stable walls, their mechanical growl growing louder as the distance closed. Ember turned from the door and walked to Becca without being asked, positioning herself beside the makeshift bed as though she understood exactly what was needed. The mare stood perfectly still as Jack brought the saddle over, her patience remarkable given the pain she had to be experiencing from her wound. He worked quickly, tightening the cinch and adjusting stirrups with hands that remembered the motions despite years of disuse. The familiarity of it was both comforting and painful, each movement a reminder of mornings with Emma, of teaching her to tack up properly, of watching her ride with the confidence of someone who believed the world was fundamentally good. The waterproof bag went into the saddlebags, secured with straps that Jack tested twice to ensure they would hold. The evidence that men were willing to kill for now rested on Ember's back, and the mare seemed to understand the weight of what she carried. Her eyes found Jack's, and he saw in them the same determination that had driven her through the night, that had kept her moving when pain and exhaustion should have forced collapse. This horse had chosen her path with full awareness of its cost, and she would see it through or die trying. Jack returned to Becca and crouched beside her, positioning himself to lift her despite his knees' protest and the pull of muscles gone soft from disuse. "This is going to hurt," he warned. She nodded, her jaw already clenched in anticipation. When he lifted her, she made a sound that was part gasp and part moan, her body going rigid as broken ribs shifted and her sprained ankle hung without support. Jack adjusted his grip, trying to distribute her weight in ways that minimized pressure on her injuries, then carried her to where Ember waited with the patience of stone. Getting Becca onto the mare's back was an exercise in controlled agony. Every movement sent fresh pain through her ribs, and her ankle could not bear even incidental pressure without causing her to bite back cries. But Ember stood motionless throughout, absorbing Becca's weight without complaint, and gradually they managed to get her positioned in the saddle with her feet in the stirrups and her hands gripping the horn with white-knuckled determination. She sat hunched forward to protect her ribs, her face the color of old snow, but she was mounted and stable enough to stay that way if Ember kept her pace smooth. Jack grabbed his rifle and what supplies he could carry, then led Ember to the rear of the stable where a door opened onto the forest behind his property. This was not an entrance he used often, the approach being steep and cluttered with deadfall, but it offered the only route that would not immediately expose them to the approaching snowmobiles. He eased the door open, wincing as hinges squealed with rust and disuse, and peered out at terrain that was both familiar and treacherous under its blanket of snow. The forest rose steeply behind the stable, pine and aspen standing in thick congregation that would make snowmobile pursuit difficult but not impossible. What Jack was counting on was the natural human tendency to check the obvious places first, to waste time searching the stable and main house before widening the search to include the backcountry. If they could get enough of a lead, if they could reach the high country before being spotted, there were places Jack knew that offered concealment and defensive positions. His years as a ranger had mapped every canyon and ridge in this region, and that knowledge was now the only advantage they possessed. He led Ember into the snow, feeling it immediately pack into his boots and send cold lancing up his legs. The mare followed without hesitation, her hooves breaking through the crust with each step, but her determination never wavering. Becca clung to the saddle horn, her breathing shallow and controlled, every jolt sending visible pain across her features. Jack moved ahead, breaking trail where the snow was deepest, using his body to create a path that would be easier for the mare to follow. The sound of snowmobiles grew louder behind them, engines revving as the riders reached the stable yard. Jack heard shouts, muffled by distance and trees, then the crash of doors being kicked open. They would find the stable empty within minutes, would see the tracks leading into the forest, and then the chase would begin in earnest. The only question was how long it would take them to realize their quarry had fled on horseback rather than on foot, and how quickly they could redirect their pursuit into terrain where snowmobiles held the advantage of speed but not necessarily maneuverability. The slope steepened as they climbed, the forest closing in around them with pine branches heavy with snow that dumped their loads with soft thuds as they passed. Jack's thighs burned with effort, his lungs working hard in the thin, cold air, and he could hear Ember's breathing becoming labored behind him. The mare was pushing through pain and exhaustion that would have stopped a lesser animal, her loyalty to Becca overriding every instinct that screamed for rest. Jack glanced back and saw blood seeping through the bandage on her shoulder, the wound reopening under the strain of movement and cold. They could not maintain this pace. Within an hour, maybe less, either Becca would lose consciousness from pain or Ember would collapse from blood loss and exhaustion. Jack needed to find shelter, a place where they could defend themselves if defense became necessary, or at minimum a position where the terrain would give them advantage over pursuers equipped with machines but unfamiliar with backcountry navigation. His mind sorted through options, discarding most as inadequate. Then he remembered the old ranger station. It had been abandoned for 15 years, a victim of budget cuts and changing priorities within the Forest Service. Jack had used it during his ranger days as a base camp for extended patrols into the high country, a small cabin built of logs and stone that had weathered decades of Montana winters. The last time he had seen it, 5 years ago during one of his rare ventures into the mountains, it had still been standing, though the roof showed signs of deterioration and the windows had been boarded over. It was not much, but it offered walls and possibly a stove that could provide heat if the chimney had not collapsed. More importantly, it was positioned on a ridge that could only be approached from 2 directions, both of which would be visible from the cabin's windows. Anyone trying to reach it would be exposed during their approach, and the ridge itself was too narrow for snowmobiles to navigate safely. They would have to come on foot, abandoning the speed advantage their machines provided, and that would level the field enough that Jack's rifle might actually matter. The ranger station was 3 miles from their current position, 3 miles of steep climbing through forest and across open meadows where exposure to wind would be brutal. Becca might not survive the journey. Ember might collapse before reaching it. But staying where they were meant certain capture, and capture meant death for Becca and destruction of the evidence she had risked everything to preserve. When the choices were between certain failure and possible survival, the decision made itself. Jack altered course, angling northeast toward the high country, and Ember followed without questioning the change in direction. The mare seemed to understand that trust was the only currency they had left, that second-guessing would waste energy none of them could spare. Becca had gone silent, her face buried against Ember's mane, her hands locked on the saddle horn with a grip that spoke of someone holding onto consciousness through sheer willpower. Jack wanted to tell her to stay awake, to talk to him so he could monitor her condition, but he knew words would cost breath and breath was too precious to waste. Behind them, the sound of snowmobiles changed pitch, engines straining as riders attempted to follow tracks into the forest. They would quickly discover that trees prevented direct pursuit, that they would have to parallel Jack's route and look for opportunities to close distance where the terrain opened up. That would buy time, precious minutes that might make the difference between reaching shelter and being run down in the open. The forest began to thin as they climbed above the dense lower elevations, pine giving way to aspen stands where snow had sculpted drifts into smooth curves that hid the true contours of the land. Jack probed ahead with a walking stick he had cut from a fallen branch, testing for hidden obstacles and weak spots where deadfall lurked beneath deceptive surfaces. Twice he nearly stepped into voids where snow had bridged over gaps between fallen logs, and once he broke through crust into a depression that swallowed him to his waist before he could pull himself free. Ember picked her way carefully through the obstacles Jack identified, her intelligence evident in the way she assessed each step before committing her weight. Becca swayed in the saddle but did not fall, her balance maintained through some combination of muscle memory and determination that defied her injuries. They moved as a unit, three wounded creatures bound by necessity and the fragile hope that survival might still be possible. The sun climbed higher, though its warmth was negligible, and Jack could feel sweat freezing on his back beneath his coat. His legs had gone from burning to numb, sensation replaced by the mechanical repetition of step after step. Time lost meaning, measured only in distance covered and obstacles overcome. They crossed a frozen stream where ice groaned beneath their weight but held, climbed through a boulder field where footing was treacherous and one wrong step would mean a fall that could break bones, traversed a meadow where wind had scoured the snow into hardpack that reflected sunlight with blinding intensity. Halfway across the meadow, Jack heard the snowmobiles again, closer now, their engines screaming as riders found a route that bypassed some of the obstacles that had slowed foot travel. He pushed harder, abandoning caution for speed, and Ember responded by lengthening her stride despite the pain it cost her. They reached the far side of the meadow and plunged back into trees just as the first snowmobile appeared at the meadow's southern edge. Jack did not look back to see if they had been spotted. Looking back would not change anything, would only waste energy and attention better spent on forward movement. He heard shouts, confirmation that they had indeed been seen. Then the snowmobile engines revving higher as pursuit intensified. The riders knew their prey was close now, wounded and slow, and the taste of imminent success would make them reckless. That recklessness might be the only advantage Jack had left. Men who thought victory was certain made mistakes, took chances they would normally avoid, pressed harder than circumstances warranted. Jack had seen it during his ranger days, rescuing climbers who had taken one risk too many because summit fever had overridden judgment. The same psychology would apply here. The hunters would push their machines into terrain that was marginally safe, would split up to cover more ground, would make themselves vulnerable in their eagerness to close the trap. The ridge where the ranger station sat came into view through the trees, a long spine of rock and earth that rose above the surrounding forest like a breaking wave frozen in stone. The cabin would be on the lee side, tucked against an outcropping that provided wind protection, and the approach from this direction would be steep but navigable for a horse willing to scramble over loose rock. Jack angled toward it, his chest heaving with effort, his vision starting to narrow at the edges from exhaustion and altitude. Ember balked at the first steep section, her hooves sliding on loose scree hidden beneath snow. Jack grabbed her bridle and pulled, adding his strength to her effort, and together they forced passage up slope that seemed determined to reject them. Becca clung to the saddle with both arms wrapped around Ember's neck, her face pressed tight against the mare's mane, every line of her body speaking to pain that had moved beyond measurement into simple endurance. They crested the ridge just as the first snowmobile reached the base of the slope below them. The rider tried to follow, his machine's track spinning uselessly on rock and ice, and Jack felt grim satisfaction as the man was forced to dismount and continue on foot. Two more snowmobiles appeared moments later, and their riders made the same discovery. The machines that had given them advantage across open ground were now liabilities, and the hunters had become hikers burdened with equipment designed for speed rather than climbing. Jack did not wait to see if they would press the pursuit on foot. He led Ember along the ridge top, moving as quickly as terrain allowed, until the ranger station appeared ahead. The cabin looked worse than he remembered, its roof sagging in the middle and one wall showing signs of rot where moisture had penetrated between the logs. But it was still standing, still offered walls and a door that could be barred. And when Jack approached the entrance, he found to his relief that the heavy wooden door remained solid despite years of neglect. He had to put his shoulder to it before the door would open, hinges frozen with rust and disuse, but it finally gave way to reveal an interior that smelled of mice and mildew but was blessedly free of snow. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising through the damaged roof but appearing intact. A rough table and two chairs sat in the center of the single room, and bunks lined the opposite wall, their mattresses long since carried away by pack rats but the frames still sturdy. It was not much, but compared to the stable or the forest, it felt like fortress and sanctuary combined. Jack helped Becca down from the saddle, catching her when her injured ankle could not support weight and carrying her to one of the bunks. She was barely conscious now, pain and exhaustion having pushed her past the limits of what willpower could compensate for. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her skin clammy despite the cold. And when Jack checked her pulse, he found it racing with a speed that worried him. She was going into shock, her body's response to trauma and stress finally overwhelming its ability to maintain normal function. He needed to get her warm, needed to stabilize her condition before it deteriorated further. But first he had to secure Ember and prepare for the confrontation he knew was coming. The riders would reach the ridge within minutes, and while the terrain gave Jack defensive advantage, 3 armed men against 1 with a bolt-action rifle meant the outcome was far from certain. He needed to stack every possible factor in his favor if he was going to keep Becca alive and protect the evidence that men had already tried to kill for. Jack led Ember into the cabin, the mare having to duck her head to fit through the doorway. The ceiling was high enough that she could stand comfortably once inside, and Jack positioned her in the corner farthest from the door where she would be protected from any gunfire that penetrated the walls. He unsaddled her quickly, his hands working with practiced efficiency despite their trembling, and removed the waterproof bag containing Becca's evidence. The bag went under the bunk where Becca lay, hidden beneath rotted boards that Jack pried up with his knife. If things went badly, if the riders somehow breached the cabin and killed both him and Becca, at least the evidence might remain hidden long enough for someone else to find it. The thought was cold comfort, but it was all Jack had to offer. He returned his attention to immediate survival, checking his rifle's ammunition again and finding he still had only 5 rounds. 5 shots to hold off 3 men, possibly more if the riders had called for backup. The mathematics were not encouraging. Jack positioned himself at one of the cabin's windows, its glass long since broken out but the opening providing clear sight lines down the ridge approach. He could see the 3 riders now, climbing steadily toward the cabin, their progress slowed by terrain and altitude, but their determination evident in the way they kept coming despite the obstacles. They moved in formation, maintaining spacing that prevented a single shot from taking out multiple targets, and they carried their weapons with the casual competence of people who had used them before. The lead rider stopped about 200 yards out, well beyond effective rifle range for anyone but an expert marksman. He raised what looked like a satellite phone to his ear, spoke briefly, then gestured to his companions. They spread out further, creating a perimeter that would let them approach the cabin from multiple angles simultaneously. Jack watched them maneuver and recognized military training in their tactics. These were not simply corporate security guards playing at being soldiers. They were actual former military, men who knew how to conduct operations in hostile territory and had the discipline to do it properly. Jack's stomach tightened as the implications settled over him. He was not facing amateurs who could be bluffed or scared off. These men would press their attack with professional competence, would use fire and maneuver to suppress his position, would eventually overwhelm him through superior numbers and training unless something shifted the balance in his favor. He needed an advantage, needed something that would make 3 trained fighters reconsider the cost of pressing their assault. Behind him, Ember moved to stand beside Becca's bunk, the mare's head lowering to investigate the unconscious woman with gentle concern. The gesture reminded Jack of something Emma used to say, watching horses interact with each other in the pasture behind their old house. They know when we're hurt, Dad. They know when we need them to be brave for us. At the time, Jack had smiled and nodded, half believing his daughter's anthropomorphization of animal behavior. Now, watching Ember's deliberate care of Becca, he wondered if Emma had understood something he had missed. The riders began their approach, moving in coordinated advances that kept at least one person in covered position while the others moved. They were 40 yards out when Jack decided he could not wait any longer to act. He aimed carefully through the window, taking time to account for wind and the way thin air at altitude affected trajectory, and fired. The shot cracked across the ridge, echoing off rock faces, and the lead rider dove for cover as the bullet struck stone inches from his position. Jack had not been trying to hit him. The shot was a message, a declaration that advancing would cost something and that cost might be higher than they wanted to pay. The riders understood. They stopped their advance and sought better cover, reassessing the situation now that they knew Jack was armed and willing to use his weapon. Jack used the pause to reload, chambering a fresh round and feeling the rifle's action with renewed appreciation for the engineer who had designed something so reliable. The standoff stretched, neither side willing to make the first move that would break the stalemate. Jack knew he could not maintain this position indefinitely. Eventually the riders would lose patience or call in reinforcements, and when that happened his defensive position would become a trap. But now, in this moment he had achieved something he had not expected. He had forced pause. He had made men with superior numbers and training stop and think about cost versus benefit. And in that pause, Jack felt something shift inside himself. The numbness that had insulated him for 8 years, the careful indifference he had cultivated like a garden of stones, began to crack. Not because he suddenly believed in justice or duty or any of the abstract concepts that had motivated him during his ranger days, but because in choosing to stand rather than run, in deciding that protecting Becca and her evidence mattered more than his own safety, he had reconnected with a part of himself he thought had died with Emma. He was not the man he had been. That person was gone, buried with his daughter and his marriage and the badge he had turned in when grief made continuing impossible. But he was not the hollow shell he had become either, the bitter hermit who locked doors and refused to care about anything beyond his own survival. He was something in between, something still being defined by choices made under pressure, and that uncertainty was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The lead rider's voice carried across the distance, amplified by the thin air and the way sound reflected off stone. "We don't want to hurt you. This isn't your fight. Just send out the woman and her bag, and you can walk away from this." Jack almost laughed at the transparent lie. Men who had already tried to kill Becca once would not suddenly develop scruples about witnesses. If he surrendered her, they would execute them both and burn the evidence, then disappear back to whatever corporate office had dispatched them in the first place. Jack's response was to chamber another round, the sound of the bolt cycling deliberately loud in the cold air. The message was clear enough that the rider did not bother repeating his offer. Instead, he gestured to his companions, and they resumed their advance with the grim patience of people who understood that some negotiations could only be concluded with violence. Ember moved to the window beside Jack, her presence both unexpected and strangely comforting. The mare looked out at the approaching men with ears forward and eyes bright, and Jack had the unsettling feeling that she was assessing the tactical situation with him, that on some level she understood what was about to happen and had decided her place was here, standing guard over the people she had chosen to protect. The first shot came from the rider's position, a crack that sent Jack ducking instinctively though the bullet struck the cabin wall well above his head. They were testing his response, trying to gauge his skill and nerve. Jack did not return fire, conserving his limited ammunition and refusing to give away his exact position. The riders fired again, 3 shots in quick succession, and this time one bullet punched through the wooden wall to embed itself in the fireplace's stone facing. Jack realized with cold clarity that the cabin's walls would not stop bullets. The logs were old and starting to rot. The chinking between them had fallen away in places, and modern ammunition would penetrate without difficulty. His defensive position was an illusion. The only things protecting him were distance, the rider's imperfect knowledge of the cabin's interior, and their apparent desire to take Becca alive if possible so they could recover the evidence without having to search for it. He needed to shift the dynamic, needed to do something the riders would not anticipate. His eyes fell on the fireplace, on the pile of wood that previous occupants had left stacked beside it. The wood was dry, years of aging having turned it into excellent kindling, and smoke was something the riders would not be expecting. It would not stop them, but it might confuse them, might create enough visual obstruction that his 5 remaining rounds would have better chance of finding targets. Jack moved quickly, gathering wood and stuffing it into the fireplace with paper. He found in what had been the ranger station's supply cabinet. He struck a match, coaxing flame to life, and within minutes had a fire burning that produced more smoke than heat. The draft in the damaged chimney was poor, and most of the smoke billowed back into the cabin rather than escaping through the roof. Within moments visibility inside dropped to a few feet, and Jack's eyes began watering from the acrid fumes. But the smoke also poured out through gaps in the walls and the broken windows, creating a gray shroud around the cabin that would make targeting difficult. The riders would have to get closer to maintain accuracy, would have to expose themselves more than they wanted, and every additional foot they came nearer increased the chance that Jack's limited ammunition could make a difference. Ember's reaction to the smoke was immediate. She snorted and backed away from the fireplace, her eyes showing white, but she did not panic. Instead, she moved to Becca's bunk and lowered her head to press against the unconscious woman's shoulder, a protective gesture that made Jack's chest tighten. The mare was terrified of the smoke, but more afraid of leaving Becca unguarded. And in that conflict she chose loyalty over fear. The sight of Ember standing guard despite her terror unlocked something in Jack that had been frozen since the day he locked the stable doors. He had spent 8 years believing that caring about others was weakness, that attachment led only to loss and loss to the kind of pain that unmade a person from the inside out. But watching this wounded mare refuse to abandon the woman she had already risked everything to save, Jack understood that he had been wrong. Caring was not weakness. It was the only thing that mattered when everything else had been stripped away. Ember was not weak for standing guard over Becca. She was the strongest creature Jack had ever known, and her strength came not from invulnerability but from the choice to remain vulnerable for the sake of someone she loved. Emma had tried to teach him that years ago with her rescued birds and her certainty that walking away from suffering was betrayal of everything good. He had forgotten the lesson in the agony of losing her, had told himself that Emma's compassion had been naivety rather than wisdom. Now, breathing smoke in a rotting cabin while armed men closed in from multiple directions, Jack finally understood what his daughter had known all along. The courage to care, to risk attachment despite knowing loss was inevitable, was the only courage that actually mattered. Everything else was just tactics and survival instinct, necessary but not sufficient for anything resembling a life worth living. The riders reached the cabin's perimeter, their forms visible as darker shadows moving through the smoke Jack's fire had created. They were converging from 3 directions, coordinating their approach with hand signals that Jack could barely see but whose meaning was clear. They would rush simultaneously from multiple angles, overwhelm his ability to respond to all threats at once, and take the cabin through speed and violence of action that would not give him time to aim carefully or choose targets. Jack settled into position with his rifle, accepting what was coming and finding himself at peace with it in a way he had not been at peace with anything for 8 years. If this was where his path ended, if standing against corporate power and protecting a woman he barely knew meant dying in a forgotten ranger station, then at least he would die as someone his daughter could have been proud of. Not the ranger he had been, not the hermit he had become, but something in between. Someone who had locked doors against pain and then, when pain came looking for him anyway, had chosen to open those doors and fight rather than hide. The riders moved in 3 separate directions, each approaching from a different angle, and Jack tracked the closest one through his rifle sights while keeping peripheral awareness of the others. He had perhaps 3 seconds before they breached the cabin, 3 seconds to decide who to target and how to maximize the impact of his 5 remaining rounds. The mathematics of it were brutal and simple. Even if every shot found its mark, he would not have enough ammunition to stop all 3 men. Someone would get through, and when they did, everything would depend on how quickly Jack could transition from rifle to hand-to-hand combat. He was no longer young enough or fit enough to win. Behind him, Ember shifted position, placing herself directly between Becca's unconscious form and the cabin door. The mare's head was up, her ears pinned flat against her skull, and every line of her body communicated readiness to fight despite her wound and exhaustion. Jack had no illusions about what would happen if armed men got past him. They would shoot Ember without hesitation, would kill anything that stood between them and their objective. But the mare had made her choice, and Jack honored it by making his own. He would not go down without taking at least one of the riders with him, would not make it easy for them to murder Becca and destroy the evidence she had gathered, would not betray the trust Ember had shown by bringing them here, by believing that Jack was someone worth finding when the world turned violent and dark. The mare had seen something in him that he had stopped seeing in himself, and he would not prove her wrong. The riders prepared for their final rush, and Jack took a breath, steadied his aim, and waited for the moment when survival would give way to whatever came after survival. In that moment of perfect clarity before violence erupted, Jack understood that he had already won the only victory that mattered. Not survival, not even justice, but the simple act of choosing to stand when standing would have been easier. Ember had taught him that. Becca had taught him that. Even Emma, speaking through memory and the values she had died believing in, had taught him that the rest was just consequences. Part 4. Crossing the threshold, the cabin door exploded inward with a crash that sent with splinters flying like shrapnel. The lead rider came through in a combat crouch, his rifle up and tracking, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had breached hostile structures more times than he could count. Jack's first shot caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. The man went down hard but immediately began crawling toward his rifle, training overriding pain, and Jack knew with sick certainty that the wound was not enough to take him out of the fight permanently. The second rider appeared at the window to Jack's left, firing through the opening in a spray that was more suppressive than accurate. Bullets tore through the cabin's interior, punching holes in walls and sending debris cascading from the rafters. Jack dropped flat, feeling the concussion of rounds passing close enough to make his ears ring. Ember screamed, a sound of pure rage and terror combined, and Jack looked up in time to see the mare charge the window where the rider was positioned. She hit the wall below the window with her full weight, and the entire structure shuddered from the impact. The rider, unprepared for an attack from a horse he had probably dismissed as irrelevant to the tactical situation, lost his balance and fell backward. His rifle discharged as he fell, the shot going wild into the sky, and then he was sliding down the rocky slope outside the cabin with nothing to arrest his descent. Jack did not have time to process what had just happened. The third rider came through the door behind the first, stepping over his wounded companion with the cold focus of someone who had learned to ignore casualties and continue the mission. This one was faster than Jack anticipated, younger and fitter, and he crossed the cabin floor in 2 strides before Jack could bring his rifle around for a second shot. They collided in a tangle of limbs and weapons, both men fighting for control of Jack's rifle while trying to bring their own firearms to bear. Jack felt his age in every movement, his muscles not responding with the speed his mind demanded, his breath coming hard from exertion and altitude. The rider was stronger, his training more recent, and slowly but inexorably he began forcing Jack's rifle down and away. Then Ember was there, rearing over them both with hooves that came down like hammers. The rider saw her at the last instant and threw himself sideways, releasing his grip on Jack's rifle to avoid being crushed. One hoof struck the floor where his head had been a moment before, the impact hard enough to crack the wooden planks, and the rider scrambled backward toward the door with his tactical composure finally broken by the sheer impossibility of being attacked by a wounded horse inside a confined space. Jack did not give him time to recover. He brought his rifle up and fired from a position that was more instinct than aim, the shot catching the rider in the leg and sending him sprawling. The man cursed, his hand going to the wound, but he still had his sidearm and he was bringing it up with the mechanical determination of someone who understood that injuries were secondary to completing the objective. The shot that stopped him came not from Jack but from the doorway. Sheriff Owen Hartley stood framed in the entrance, his service weapon still raised and smoking, his face pale but his hands steady. Behind him, Jack could see 2 more figures, and his heart sank thinking reinforcements had arrived for the corporate riders. Then he recognized Vernon Mitchell, the veterinarian from Willow Ridge, and Ruth Brennan, his own sister, both armed and looking as shocked as Jack felt at finding themselves in the middle of what looked like a war zone. Owen stepped into the cabin, his weapons still covering the riders, though 2 were down and the third had disappeared down the slope outside. He looked at Jack, at Ember standing over Becca's unconscious form with blood streaming from her reopened shoulder wound, at the smoke still billowing from the fireplace, and his expression suggested he was reassessing every assumption he had made about what he would find when he followed the trail of rumors that had brought him to Broken Pine Ranch. "We got a call about gunfire," Owen said, his voice carefully neutral. "Multiple shots, automatic weapons maybe, coming from the direction of the old ranger station. Came up to investigate and found snowmobiles abandoned at the base of the ridge." He paused, his eyes moving to the wounded riders. "Seems like we arrived at an interesting time." Jack lowered his rifle, his hands shaking now that adrenaline was fading and leaving exhaustion in its wake. "These men tried to kill a woman who has evidence of Cascade mining illegally dumping toxins into Clearwater Creek. They've been hunting her since yesterday, shot her horse, and would have finished the job if I hadn't intervened." His voice was hoarse from smoke inhalation and stress, but the words came out clear enough. Owen's expression did not change, but Jack saw calculation happening behind his eyes. The deputy marshal was young, maybe 30, and he had a reputation in Willow Ridge for being honest but also for being careful about which battles he chose to fight. Cascade Mining employed half the town directly or indirectly, and accusations against them carried political weight that could destroy careers. Jack had no idea which side of that equation Owen would land on when forced to choose. "The woman," Owen said. "Where is she?" Jack gestured to the bunk where Becca lay with Ember still standing guard. "She's unconscious, probably hypothermic. Definitely has broken ribs and a badly sprained ankle. She needs medical attention more than she needs anything else right now." Vernon was already moving, his veterinarian training transferring to human medicine with the ease of someone who understood that bodies were bodies regardless of species. He pushed past Jack and knelt beside Becca, his hands moving with professional confidence as he checked her vitals and assessed her injuries. Ruth stayed by the door, her rifle held with the awkward grip of someone not entirely comfortable with firearms but willing to use one if necessary. She caught Jack's eye and offered a small smile that carried more meaning than words could have conveyed. They had not spoken in 3 years, the distance between them having grown as Jack's isolation deepened. But she had come anyway when word reached her that her brother might be in danger. That meant something Jack did not have the emotional capacity to process at the moment. Owen holstered his weapon and pulled out handcuffs, securing the 2 wounded riders with efficient movements before calling for medical evacuation on his radio. Then he turned his full attention to Jack, and his expression had shifted from neutral assessment to something that might have been respect. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." So Jack told him. About the mare arriving in the storm, about finding Becca in the locked stable, about the evidence she carried and the conspiracy she had uncovered. He told Owen about the attack at dawn, about the decision to run rather than be cornered, about the desperate climb to the ranger station and the standoff that had nearly ended in all of them dying. He left nothing out because he understood that half-truths would undermine credibility, and credibility was all they had against an opponent with resources and political connections that dwarfed anything Jack could marshal. When he finished, Owen was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to where Jack had hidden the waterproof bag beneath the bunk's floorboards and pulled it out. He opened it carefully, spreading the contents across the cabin's rough table, and began reading through documents and test results with the focused attention of someone who understood he was looking at something significant. His expression grew darker with each page he turned, and by the time he reached the financial records showing bribes paid to the state environmental inspector, his jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. "This is real," Owen said, and it was not a question. All of it. The contamination, the cover-up, the bribes. He looked up at Jack with eyes that had gone hard. "They poisoned the water my nephew drinks. My sister fills her baby's bottles from that reservoir." Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The weight of what Becca had discovered was settling over all of them, the implications spreading like ripples in water. Every family in Willow Ridge, every child who had grown sick in the past 2 years, every unexplained death that had been attributed to natural causes. All of it connected to decisions made in corporate offices by people who valued profit over life. Owen's radio crackled with a response to his medical evacuation request. Helicopter was inbound, estimated arrival 20 minutes, and they were sending additional law enforcement to secure the scene and transport the prisoners. Owen acknowledged the transmission, then turned back to Jack with an expression that suggested he had made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "I'm taking this evidence into custody," Owen said, gesturing to the documents spread across the table. "And I'm placing you, Ms. Foster, and these men under protective custody until I can sort out who's compromised and who isn't. Cascade has enough reach that I don't trust anyone in the local system right now. We're going to take this straight to the federal EPA and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Helena. Let them sort out jurisdiction and prosecutions." His voice carried the weight of someone crossing a line he knew he could not uncross. "My job was supposed to be simple. Keep the peace, arrest drunks, maybe break up a domestic dispute on Saturday nights. This is way beyond my pay grade, but it's also too important to pass off to someone who might bury it." Vernon stood from where he had been working on Becca, his face grave. She's stable but needs a hospital. The hypothermia is under control, but those ribs are broken badly enough that I'm worried about punctured lung. And she's showing signs of infection from various cuts and scrapes. She'll survive, but she needs more than I can provide here. He turned to look at Ember, and his expression softened. This Mare, though, she's something else. That shoulder wound should have put her down hours ago. But she's still standing guard like she's on duty. I've never seen anything like it. Jack moved to Ember's side, laying a hand on her neck and feeling the trembling that ran through her body. The Mare was at the end of her reserves, held upright by will rather than strength, and Jack knew that once she allowed herself to rest she might not get back up. He pulled Vernon aside, speaking quietly so the others would not overhear. Tell me honestly, can she survive this? Vernon met his eyes without flinching. If we can get her to a proper facility, if we can control the infection and give her time to heal, then yes. But she needs surgery to properly clean that wound, antibiotics stronger than what I carry in my truck, and weeks of careful monitoring. It's going to be expensive and time-consuming, and there's no guarantee. Some horses would have given up by now. She hasn't, which means she's a fighter. But even fighters have limits. Jack nodded, the information settling into place alongside all the other costs this day had accumulated. He had no money for expensive veterinary care, no resources beyond a failing ranch and the small pension from his ranger days. But he looked at Ember, at the way she still positioned herself between Becca and any potential threat despite barely being able to stand, and knew that cost was irrelevant. This Mare had come to him in a storm, had trusted him with a burden he did not want, and had fought beside him when fighting should have been beyond her capacity. He would not abandon her now, regardless of what it cost him. The sound of helicopter rotors began echoing off the ridge face, growing louder as the medical evacuation drew near. Owen organized the scene with efficient authority, securing the prisoners and gathering evidence while Vernon prepared Becca for transport. Ruth stayed close to Jack, not speaking but offering the silent support of presence, and Jack found himself grateful for her in ways he had forgotten how to articulate. When the helicopter landed in the small clearing below the ridge, its downdraft kicking up snow in blinding swirls, Jack helped carry Becca down the slope on a makeshift stretcher Vernon had fashioned from pine branches and rope. She stirred briefly as they moved her, her eyes opening to focus on Jack's face with confusion before clarity returned. She tried to speak, her lips forming words that the helicopter noise drowned out, but Jack understood anyway. Ember. She was asking about the Mare, her first conscious thought directed toward the animal who had saved her life. Jack leaned close enough for her to hear him over the rotor wash and said simply, "She's safe. We're all safe now. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out."